Asia, I have looked at the manner in which Southeast Asian societies have been studied through the lens of power, especially colonial power. So let's attempt to narrow down our focus here. As I mentioned earlier, the study of Islam is not new. It has been going on for hundreds of years, but I'm particularly interested in a particular type of study of Islam. And this is when Islam was studied by the West. And of course, I'm sure all of us here are familiar with the works of Edward Said and the legacy of Edward Said's thought, from his seminal work, Orientalism, 1978, all the way till today. But parallel to the work of Edward Said is another important book, which is the work of Syed Hussein Alatas, The Myth of the Lazy Native, also published around the same time, 1978, 1979. In these works, we see the beginnings of a study of a study. Yeah, it is from this moment onwards that the study of Islam is being studied itself. We begin to study the mode of study. We begin to study the mode of knowledge production. And as we can see in the writings and the works of people like Edward Said and Syed Hussein Alatas, the study of Islam, particularly from the 19th century, has never been a neutral endeavor. It is something that is intimately linked to concerns of power, especially during the colonial period. Now we fast forward 100 years, and by the time we get to the 20th century, we begin to see Islamic studies emerging as a discipline in the humanities. And it is interesting to note, and we can't deny this, it is interesting to note that when we look at the landscape, the academic landscape of the study of Islam, the beginnings of Islamic studies, apart from the Muslim world, it originates in the Western world as well. Yeah, there are many other parts of the world that are relatively unconcerned about Islam and Muslim societal life, but it emanates from the West. And the tradition of Islamic studies that emerges in the West, whether we like it or not, whether we want to admit it or not, is built upon an earlier tradition of colonial knowledge production. Yeah. And since we are here in Jogja and we're in Java, we can cite works that some of you might be familiar with. Stamford Raffles' work, The History of Java, 1817, which on the surface reads as a colonial account of the history of Java, but when we read the book carefully, it is also a study of Muslims in Java and the study of Islam in Java, but written and understood and framed through the lens of colonial capitalism. And it is from these works from the 19th century that Islamic studies as we know it today in the West was built. Yeah. Works of people like Raffles, colonial anthropologists and early colonial functionaries who began to write about Muslim society because Muslim society had come under colonial influence and colonial rule. Fast forward to the present today, and where do we see Islamic studies? Islamic studies, of course, evolved and developed in the interwar years and continue to develop in the post-war years and develop during the Cold War into the post-Cold War era. And throughout that time, we can see some very important shifts in the way in which Islam and Muslims were understood in the West, again and again, guided by geopolitical, geostrategic, geoeconomic concerns. So the way in which Islam was seen and studied during the Cold War is very different compared to the way in which Islam and Muslims were studied after the Cold War. And here, of course, we are in Indonesia, we are in Southeast Asia. All of us here have been impacted by 9/11. And we know what 9/11 did to Islamic studies. It securitized Islam. It turned Islam and Muslims into a security concern. Even though the tools of analysis ostensibly appear to be the same: anthropology, sociology, ethnography, scriptural studies, textual studies. But the perception of Islam and the perception of Muslims shifted. In the course of Islamic studies, we can see these shifts happening all the time. Every new era brings with it a new understanding, a new sensibility, and a new way of looking at Islam. And today, whether we would like to admit it or not, it's not a comfortable thing to deal with, but the fact remains that the way in which Islam is seen today, particularly in the global media, and the global media is the Western media, these biases remain deeply embedded in the way in which Islam is seen and Muslims are portrayed. Which brings me to the main topic of this workshop and this seminar, which is the legacy of Martin van Bruinessen and Martin's work. I'm deeply honored to be here in the company of Martin van Bruinessen, because I believe that Martin's work is of enormous importance, not only to Islamic studies and the study of Muslim societies worldwide, but in particular in the study of Islam and Muslim society in Southeast Asia and Indonesia in particular. Why? Because as we all know, as I mentioned earlier, in the way in which Islam became a security concern in the West, in the way in which Muslims were presented and seen and framed as a security concern in the West, there were few voices of reason and objectivity and clarity that continued to emphasize the humanity of Muslims, the mundaneness, the ordinariness of Muslim social life as something that can be understood scientifically, objectively, clearly, without these Orientalist biases and fear that was generated around the question of Islam and Muslim politics. I think there are two very important contributions that have been made by Martin when it comes to promoting an understanding of Islam that is academic, objective, factual, in the wider landscape of global academia. The first is, and for this I'm truly grateful to Martin, Martin brought Indonesia back into the Muslim world. Yeah. Why do I say this? Because for the longest time, especially in Western academic circles, the Muslim world stopped at Pakistan. And the rest of us, I'm not sure what we were, but Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, other parts of the Muslim world were somehow not seen as part of the Muslim world through a Western academic lens. Yeah? The study of Islam, the study of Muslim world was somehow very narrowly confined from Turkey to North Africa, all the way to Pakistan, and then stop. Martin reminded the world that, hang on, there is another part of the Muslim world that you have not focused on enough, including Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim country. And I think for this, we in Southeast Asia owe a lot to Martin for his continued emphasis on the location of Islam and the borders of the Muslim world, constantly reminding Western scholars that there is a much wider global phenomenon of Islam and that Indonesia is part of it. The second important contribution to Martin, and this also is something I'm deeply grateful for to Martin, is for people like us, particularly those of us who worked or used to work on political Islam. Yeah. The idea that Muslim politics and political Islam can and should be understood objectively, academically, scientifically as a valid form of academic research, I think is hugely important, because as we know, especially here in Indonesia, post 9/11, there was a period, especially in the first decade of the 21st century, where if you go back and you go on the internet, you read the headlines from international media, whenever Indonesia was mentioned, it was always about terror, terror, terror. Yeah. The need to emphasize that behind what appears to be political violence is a very complex and dynamic, organic experience of lived Islam, and that political Islam is not focused on violence, but focused on other things, ranging from politics of identity to actual socio-economic agendas and demands and needs, basically rehumanized Islam. It reminded us in the academic field that when we study Muslim politics, we are studying Muslim human beings who, like all human beings, have political aspirations, cultural aspirations, economic aspirations, and aspirations for other things beyond simple oppositional politics. I think these two contributions from Martin are hugely important because myself, at that time, when working in the domain of political religion in general, it reached a point where you could not have a discussion on political religion without talking about either extremism or violence, or few own lonely, sane voices, suara yang waras, yang rasional, that remind us that no, we must study political and politics as a human phenomenon and not allow it to be put in a smaller studies. I think these two are lasting and they're hugely important for all of us here. This workshop brings together a number, many of whom have worked with Martin, read Martin's works, have been tutored by Martin, mentored by Martin, and I think it is a fitting tribute to the legacy of Martin Bruinessen that we him today for, I think, these many important contributions to the way in which we understand Islamic studies itself. It's thanks to the legacy of Martin, the work of Martin van Bruinessen, that Islamic studies today is not simply the study of Muslims like insects under a microscope, but rather a complex human phenomenon called Muslim world. And I think for myself, my life, for always reminding me that even in my work as a political historian, it is important always to remember the humanity of the human subjects that we study. So with that, thank you very much, Martin, and thank you very much, organizers, for allowing me to be here. Jangan nangis, Martin.
Okay, finish. Thank you very much, Professor Faris Nur, for your enlightening talks. We can take some notes on his talks. That first is that the production of knowledge production of Islamic studies can never be isolated from politics. This, I think, the main arguments that Professor Faris want to develop. And the next is that the developing of Islamic studies after 9/11 changed to the securitized Islam. Within that mode of Islamic studies, Professor Martin, according to Professor Faris, has contributed in two main things. One is bringing Indonesian Muslim to Islam.
Within the Muslim, to Islamic studies.
To Islamic studies. Yeah. Make Islamic studies see Indonesia not in the periphery, but in the central of the study. And then the second is the objective study. They need to study of Islam in an objective way, Indonesian Islam in objective way. Thank you. And then now we move to the next speakers, who is Professor Hilman Latif. Before that, I think I will mention his biographical bit. Like Professor Hilman Latif is my former classmate, and he now is the Dirjen Haji. He wrote a lot of works on Indonesian Islam and wrote dissertation on charity, Islamic charity. I think now, apart from being the Dirjen Haji, he is also professor at UMY, Universitas Muhammadiyah Yogyakarta. Professor Latif, time is yours. And wrote dissertation on charity, Islamic charity. I think now, apart from being
thanks for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Dirjen Haji is also professor at UMY, Universitas Muhammadiyah.
Teacher, professor.
Professor Latif, time is yours.
With whom I experienced
dissertation on
academically
charity,
during
charity.
my studentship at Utrecht University.
Now,
I believe here also some thanks for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Dirjen Haji,
Mujib,
professor
also trained by Pak Martin,
UMY, Universitas Muhammadiyah.
Professor.
Professor Latif,
Remember how hard to pass by with whom I article in front of him
dissertation on
rubbish
charity.
you just like pejabat orde baru. Excuse me, Prof, what do you mean? Banyak ngomong gak ada isinya. So that's, I still remember. So from Pak Martin, and I try to not to bring my feelings here because I already consult with my senior Professor Mujib and Professor Nur Haidi Hasan, who reminds me with this situation. So kalau Martin ngomong gitu, masuk sini, keluar sini. Don't bring your heart or your feelings when academically, because, but I like him very much because once we came out from his office, everything is just like friends. Hilman, sudah jalan-jalan kemana? Sudah Anda kunjungi Eropa, Belanda, apa saja yang sudah Anda lihat? But a minute after we entered the rooms, the the ones, the milieu, the situation changed, and he speak English all the time in his room during our consultation. Okay, thank you, Pak Faris. I think many years ago we had a nice day for coffee and something. I am my dear colleagues here, Pak Senior, Pak Prof Masin. When we were in Holland, Pak Masin also stay in my home. I remember in my kos-kosan actually, apartment. My topic is about my reflection actually. It's based my reflection and my discussion with my colleagues here, Muhammadiyah Circle, and we were wondering how Muhammadiyah was accepted culturally in my home and formally in my people of Kauman and Muslims in Yogyakarta. Okay, I try to My topic is
detach,
about
the terms of modernism and
reflection,
traditionalism
my reflection and
in
my
my
discussion
with my
with the
colleague, my friend,
circle.
in Muhammadan
And we were
circles,
wondering
as well
how
as my friend from
Muhammadiyah
Nahdayin,
accept
because I want to
culturally
discuss what happened formally
in my
by
concept
change of Muhammadiyah in 1912,
and
as well as between
Yogyakarta.
1912
Okay.
and 1926.
I try
the
to
Nahdlatul Ulama
my topic
detach,
is about
the terms of modernism and
express my
traditionalism
reflection and
in
my
my
discussion
with
with
my
my
colleague, my friend,
circle.
in
And
Muhammadan
we were
circle,
wondering
Martin van Bruinessen, this is Kitab Kuning and Pesantren Traditions many years ago, and formally
in my
by
concept
colleagues here, Muhammadiyah in 1912, as well as between traditions,
Okay.
and
Both
cultures.
I try to be my topic
competence in terms of modernism and tradition and culture,
reflection and my
discussion with my
colleagues
friend,
to me
when I observe Muhammadan circle, Martin van Bruinessen, Kitab Kuning and Pesantren Traditions many years ago, educational background of colleagues here, Muhammadiyah in 1912, as well as before that, they were mainly
both cultures.
try to be
My topic competence
in terms of modernism and tradition and culture,
reflection and my discussion.
my friend, to me, when I observe Muhammadan circle, Martin van Bruinessen, Kitab Kuning and Pesantren Traditions many years ago, educational background of colleagues here, Muhammadiyah in 1912, as well as before that, they were mainly
Both cultures.
try to be
My topic competence
in terms of modernism and tradition and culture,
reflection and my discussion.
and to me, when I observe Muhammadan circle, Martin van Bruinessen, Kitab Kuning and Pesantren Traditions many years ago, educational background of colleagues here, Muhammadiyah in 1912, as well as before that, they were mainly
Both cultures.
try to be
My topic competence
modernism and tradition and culture,
reflection and my discussion.
and when I observe Muhammadan circle, Van Bruinessen, Kitab Kuning and Pesantren Traditions many years ago, educational background of colleagues here, Muhammadiyah in 1912, as well as before that, they were mainly
Both cultures.
try to be
My topic competence
modernism and tradition and culture,
reflection and my discussion.
and when I observe Muhammadan circle, Van Bruinessen, Kitab Kuning and Pesantren Traditions many years ago, educational background of colleagues here, Muhammadiyah in 1912, as well as before that, they were mainly
Both cultures.
try to be
My topic competence
the founder of Syarikat Modernism and Tradition and Culture,
reflection and my discussion.
when I observe Muhammadan circle,
and was educated
Kuning
in
and
Mojodari, Magelang, as well as
education
Pesantren Thammas.
of colleagues here, Muhammadiyah in 1912,
Before that,
as well as before that,
he also
Kiai Amin,
Both cultures.
was
Trying to be
my
my topic competence
during the founder of Syarikat Modernism and Tradition and Culture,
reflection and my discussion.
he was educated in Pondok Rapiak,
I
Pasuruan,
observe
and
Muhammadan
Yahya
circle,
Kemudian
and
was
as well as
educated in
Kuning,
Mojodari, Magelang, as well as studies Pesantren Thammas, Mahfud Altam.
colleagues here, Muhammadiyah in
Before that,
as well as
before that he also
Kiai Amin,
in Arabic manuscript and was working with Martin van Bruinessen
during the founder of
Kitab Kuning.
Syarikat
I didn't realize that there are many thoughts. He was educated in Tirkulia, Pasuruan, and Yahya Kemudian was educated in Mojodari, Magelang, as well as studies Pesantren Thammas, Mahfud Altam. Before that, he also
Kiai Amin,
in Arabic manuscript and was working with Martin van Bruinessen
during the founder of
Kitab Kuning.
Syarikat
I didn't realize that there are many thoughts. He was educated in Tirkulia, Pasuruan, and Yahya Kemudian was was educated in Ojodari, Magelang, Stories, he was educated in Tirukale, Suraf, and was educated in Ojodari, Magelang, Stories, he was educated in Tirukale, Suraf, and was educated in Ojodari, Magelang, he was educated in Tirukale, Suraf, and was educated in Ojodari, Magelang, he was educated in Tirukale, Ojodari, he was educated in Tirukale, Ojodari, he was educated in Tirukale, Audi learned to enter was educated in Bakir al-Jogja. He wrote some works on hadith. However, he wants to come back to Qawm al-Jogja. Audi learned to enter Saudi. Was educated in Bakir al-Jogja. He wrote some works on hadith. However, he wants to come back to Qawm al-Jogja. Audi learned to enter Saudi. Was educated in
Professor Hamad Asghar wrote some works on this. However, back to my comment that United States having Saudi and Saudi very much he's been very much influenced by Islamic modernism in the Middle East. Yeah, my proposed argument to be developed. I mean, the argument to be developed in my paper for Martin book, focus on the role of a Pesantren tradition in giving a solid Islamic foundation, and at the same time enriching the Muslim perspectives among Indonesian Islamic scholars, including in Kauman. And because, yeah, that's I want to explore further, because in my view, it's not simply about bringing the thought of Muhammad Abdul, the thought of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab. Even I challenge those who say that Muhammadiyah in the earliest period is called or influenced by Wahhabism. Because I try to discover evidence, what sort of ideas or articles or books formulated in Muhammadiyah that relates to Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab. And I saw no connection at all. I didn't find. Yes, Ahmad Dahlan went to Mecca, to Saudi, and Hashim Ash'ari went also to Saudi Arabia, almost in the same period, but Dahlan's earlier. K. Hashim Ash'ari is later. Then Mahfud At-Tarmasi already there, and then Muhammad Bakir. After Dahlan returns to Indonesia, Muhammad Bakir from Kauman also sent the children to Mecca, but he never come back. Even when this, according to a story, Dahlan's second visit to Mecca is also to bring his nephew to be back to Kauman, but he refused and he wants to study there. And because he was awarded, according to Majalah Al-Munir, one of the 7 Indonesian Mashayikh who are approved or allowed to teach in Haram, in Masjid al-Haram. He's the youngest. That's the Dahlan's nephew. Along with him, also, okay, Wahab Hasbullah, okay, Mas Mansur. So all they study in Saudi, but Mas Mansur then went to Cairo. And the interesting situation was some second generation in Kauman sent their children not to Mecca afterwards, but mainly to Cairo. So that's interesting situation. And I try, my last point, I try to redefine what the modernist Islamic movement at the time was. Sometimes people think that Muhammadiyah or Nahdlatul Ulama is in the past is like in the current forms of the movement. Yes, Muhammadiyah was called as the modernist, but in what sense? Fiqh, according to some source, it's still the same. Shafi, yeah. Some works written by even in the first page, Mbak, tolong ke halaman pertama ya. In the first page of my okay, yeah. So kitab fiqh produced by Muhammadiyah was really Shafi'i, really Shafi'i. Ya kunut, tarawihnya berapa rakaat tuh? Banyak juga, Pak. 23 ya. 23 sholatnya. Ketika mau sholat harus membaca. Itu ada, Pak, di situ. solely. Nah, ini yang kemudian so some student or writer here Muhammadiyah in the past is NU. No, NU didn't exist at the time. Okay, this published in 1923 and NU was established in 1926. And this I want to enlighten to my colleague, my friends, when discussing Muhammadiyah and another ulama, including ulama, sometimes we are trapped in our understandings of organization right now. But truly, Ahmad Dahlan married to women from Krapyak. Some of Krapyak's leaders stay in Kauman. They married to people in Jombang, and a lot of and even to Tariqah Shatariya. Also, the family is very rich background. And again, the mystery is why and how ideas of Dahlan when introducing Muhammadiyah could accepted by those the students of Hashim Ash'ari, okay, from Jombang, like in Kota Gede. Also, those who graduated from Tambak Beras, from Tebu Ireng, from Magelang, and that's my position and my last statement until now. The chairman of the Majlis Tarjih of Muhammadiyah is a graduate of Tambak Beras. And some of people who read and studies and formulate Islamic law or fiqh in Majlis Tarjih were graduates of Maduri Pesantren or Isjaba in Jombang. So, well, a lot of things exchange in the community. Then that's the argument to be developed. Thank you so much, Pak Sunarwat.
Thank you, Professor Hilman Latif, for your very enlightening talks. And we know that Professor Latif was talking about what happened before the establishment of Muhammadiyah and NU. And we saw that the connection between people who behind the establishment of these two organizations were very closely connected. And this is very important to see the later development of these two organizations, which seemingly sometimes contrasting or seen as contrasting, but historically it is not. Okay, we move to the next talks by Professor Yasuko Kobayashi, who will be talking about Fakhruddin and Sri Diponegoro. Professor Yasuko is from Nanjing University. Her research interests are in Islam in Southeast Asia and modern Indonesian history. She wrote a lot of works, but in I see on the website, but most of her works in Japanese language. So I could not mention the latest works of her. So, sorry me, but I want to want to mention one article published in Studia Islamica in 2014, Kiai and Japanese Military.
Yes,
Yes?
yes,
Okay.
it's on.
Okay, Professor Yasuko, time is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, friends. I'm very happy to be here with you at this seminar, a tribute to Professor Martin from Bruinessen. I want to express my special thanks to the coordinators of this seminar. my old friends, Liz and Nur, and Dr. Farish Nur, whom I met here for the first time, although I have known his name for a long time as a scholar engaged in person. Well, I also agree that since Martin joined the fields of Indonesian studies, he has enhanced Islamic studies and inspired fellow researchers. Dr. Farish Nur discussed the program rather theoretically, and Dr. Human Latif discussed the relationship between Muhammadiyah and the Islamic tradition. And I will discuss something new, a specific theme empirically. Okay, next. I'm proud to say that I'm one of the most enthusiastic readers of Martin's works. I have written 2 review articles on his works in Japanese journals. One was for Tariqat Naqshbandiya, next, and the other was for Nahdlatul Ulama. His works have captured the attentions of Japanese Indonesians, shedding light on Islam in general, and more especially on the traditional association with his championing of NU. He introduced NU very powerfully and espoused for its recognition and importance in Indonesian society. Okay, next. This is his magnum opus, a monumental work. In this work, his attention is focused on primordial loyalties, which worked in social political conflicts. It is natural that in Indonesia too, he directed his attention toward ulama or kiai. He has written extensively on NU and its tradition, while the other mainstream Muslim association, Muhammadiyah, is left rather unexplored. But today, Mas Hirman discussed Muhammadiyah. However, Martin had once seemed to be attracted to a Muhammadiyah figure. Okay, next. It was Haji Fahruddin. Martin mentioned his name in his article in 1995. Martin wrote, Haji Fahruddin emerged at this meeting. This is the Caliphate Committee meeting in Surabaya, as a more thoughtful leader than the practical politician Chokro Aminoto. Next. Fahruddin was the first vice president of Muhammadiyah after its founder, Ahmad Dahlan, passed away. He became the driving force behind the development of Muhammadiyah from a local association to a nationwide organization. Today, I will talk about Fahruddin's younger days before he became vice president of Muhammadiyah. Well, Fahruddin's name can be found in these books. In colonial literatures, his name came up together with Dahlan. Pay attention to the Encyclopedia of the Netherlands Indies in 1930. Just a year after he died, Fahruddin had already become an icon in that volume. It reveals that he was a very well-known figure at the time. In Tamarajaya's book, Fahruddin was included among the great figures in the national history. Moreover, Pringgo Digdo, an Indonesian historian, emphasized Fahruddin's achievement for the organization. After the independence of Indonesia, he was honored as a national hero in 1964. However, in the revised edition of Tamarajaya in 1966, Fahruddin disappeared. It seemed he was forgotten in the era of Suharto's new order, even by the Muhammadan people. Yeah. Conversely, his name can be found in academic works. Alfian, who described the development Muhammadiyah during the colonial time, wrote more about Fahardin than Dahlan. Additionally, Shiraishi mentioned Fahardin repeatedly and paid attention to him as a somewhat important figure in the era of political movement, Zaman Pergerakan. Recently, Muarif, an Indonesian researcher, revived Fahardin by publishing his biography. Okay, next. Now, I will narrate a short biography of Fahardin based on Yunus Anis. Fahardin was born in Kauman, Jogja. His childhood name was Jazri. His father was a palace servant working as a ruler. His house was next to Dahlan's residence. He was taught Quran by his father at home. He did not enjoy modern formal education nor traditional Islamic education. He once went to Pesantren in Monokromo, but he was not happy there. Cepat keluar saja ya. Yeah, and he said that he was a graduate from a school under a sawo tree. He was a self-educated man. He once stayed in Mecca about a couple of years and changed his name to Fahardin. In 1907, he returned to Java. Dahlan advised his disciples to join any organization to gain experience. Zaman Pergerakan had already started. Fahardin associated himself with several organizations. In addition to Muhammadian, I can only confirm that he was active in Budi Utomo and Syarikat Islam. He also simultaneously began his career in journalism. He learned how to write a column under the tutelage of Mas Marco. Okay, next. How can we know Fahardin more? I want to emphasize the potential of periodic articles as historical materials. Fahardin was involved in several newspapers and magazines. He once confessed that surat kabar was a means of communication by which he could express himself most freely. He was involved in these periodicals and contributed columns. The most important publication in this context is Bintang Islam. You can see the English title of The Star of Islam in the coverage. This magazine is still held in the National Library in Jakarta. This bi-weekly magazine is rich in information. Fahardin was its editor-in-chief. In particular, the column Overseas Affairs, Overseas News is interesting and instructive. We can learn how Fahardin viewed the Indonesian society and the world through these works. But today, Sri Dipo Negro was a weekly magazine and edited by him when he was still growing as a journalist. It was published in Malay. Today, I focus on Sri Dipo Negro to examine Fahardin's interest and perspective. Next. Unfortunately, many periodicals are no longer available. The original copies of Sri Dipo Negro cannot be found either. As an alternative, we can refer to IPO. IPO is a weekly report of monitoring periodicals by Balai Pustaka. IPO means Survey of the Native Press. IPO is a Dutch official weekly report which monitored vernacular press for the latest news and information on the native society. 3 Dipo Negro summaries also can be found in IPO. IPO was a confidential report at the time, and about 60 periodicals were monitored. In IPO, 3 Dipo Negro was classified as an extremist magazine. It is thus clear that the purpose of IPO was to search for political leaders who were unfavorable for the government. After IPO became public, this classification changed and the categorization of extremist newspaper disappeared. Its classification became more rational. Now, IPO can be accessed on the website Delphi. Everyone can see that. IPO is useful for historical research, but we should be careful with its usage because it was edited through the prism of colonial bias. For example, 3 Dipo Negro published a column on region in each of its volumes, but it was omitted. IPO probably did not have any interest in religious teachings. Anyway, IPO can be used as material if we use it carefully. In IPO, from October 1918 to April 1919, about 120 columns of 3 Dipo Negro can be found. Its summaries, a variety of information concerning difficulties and complaints of the native people of the time. It was a time of difficulties caused by World War I. And Muhammadiyah was still not well known at the time. Next. Okay. In these about 120 columns, the term Kuromo often appeared without being translated into Dutch. This word means the little man or common people. This term was treated rather nervously by IPO editors. In this context, Kuromo was identical with the marginal people or the suppressed Bangsan. In fact, Kuromo was one of the keywords that mobilized the Pergerakan. It reflected burgeoning nationalism and socialist tendencies. Islamic identity was often expressed in anti-Christianization context. There was, however, also some criticism that the Muslims did not know their religion well. The government was repeatedly criticized for not responding to the people's demand for schools. It was also asserted that Muslims should build their own schools so that children will not be led to conversion. Many writers used pseudonyms, but Fahrenheit wrote using his real name. We now look at his own reports on his experience. Okay. Okay, next. A dispute over an autopsy between common people and the administrative authority. Fahrenheit commented about a fuss in which he was involved. The red letters on the slide show government officials. A girl died near Common, and the monthly enlichter of the Health Bureau came and tried to puncture her body for examination. The pious father forbade this measure since Islam strictly prohibited damaging a corpse unless some symptoms of disease was detected. A European doctor came and ordered the people who came to that house to be quarantined, although he did not examine the body. This case was reported to the vice resident. He suggested to the people to choose between the body to be punctured or people to be quarantined. They chose the latter. Fahardin said, healthy people can become sick in such a barrack. Fahardin asked permission for Friday prayer as a great mass, but it was denied. 1 hour after that, the vice president, the doctor Bupati Kota, and 4 policemen came collectively to the barrack of the quarantine. Fahardin was surprised at the sight. He said, "What's all this?" with the authorities' reaction. Fahardin thought that the vice president and the doctor were afraid of riots, such as those that had occurred in Kudus. Later, the vice president and the Bupati Kota sent the Bupati Kota to Dahlan. He asked Dahlan to persuade his friends not to protest against the government. But Dahlan would not interfere in this matter. Rather, he asked for help so that his recent subsidy application for these schools would not be affected by this incident. In Sri Dipo Negro, there are few columns about the punctual dispute in which a monthly enlister was attacked by the people. Such cases often happened in those days. This report showed that Fahardin was living among the common people that had the courage, but he had the courage to criticize the government. Okay, the next one, next report. The second one. As a member of Budi Utomo, Fahardin participated in the project coordinated by the organization to provide food and jobs for impoverished people at Allen. He brought 18 people there, but they had to face with the hostile attitude of panel officer. According to the people who had been there to receive the aid, the service was not satisfying. They preferred to continue begging in town. How should Budi Utomo take care of this problem? Fahardin meant that the persons in charge of this project should put themselves in the shoes of the poor people and reconsider how they can make this program more acceptable and become more useful for the people. The third one, once 44 coolies came to Fahardin to ask for help. At this time, Fahardin was vice chair of the Sarikat Islam branch of Jogja. Coolies complained about unsatisfactory payment. Fahardin negotiated with the contractor about the fee and obtained a promise that he would pay enough money, responding to the coolies' demands. However, the contractor did not appear the following day, despite his promise. Sarikat Islam paid up a part of the fee up front, and Fahardin went to the contractor personally to collect the money. Around these years, Central Sarikat Islam was busy reorganizing itself into a modern Islamic party, while small problems such as this case were entrusted to local branches. Fahardin demonstrated that the Bumiputra organization, such as Sarikat Islam, was expected to be relied on by marginalized people. Okay, next. Well, this is the last report. Fahardin noted that When he was looking at a sugar cane fields from Georgia to Solo, a bad idea occurred to him. He said that the main cause of food shortage was sugar cane, which occupies the most of the rice fields. Sugar cane planting should be stopped, and the rice or other fast-fruiting plants should be planted instead. The villagers should be allowed to cut down sugar canes without permission from the sugar plantations. Or how about burning off the sugar cane if they had to wait long? All is dependent on the villagers, he thought. But village people would not or could not read newspapers, nor would they organize a union. It was thus difficult to bolster their courage. He said, I would help them if the peasants' union would persuade villagers to act. Okay, next. Just after the column Sugarcane and Rice was published, Fahaldin probably noticed a reaction from the local government. He expressed that he would resign from the position of its chief editor. Suri Diponegoro would be handed down to Jogja Sarekat Islam and would become its organ. In fact, Fahaldin was punished because that his report, Sugarcane and Rice, was considered an infringement on press regulation. He said 300 guilders. He paid 300 guilders instead of being detained in a cage for 3 months. The following month, his name remained as a co-editor, but he did not write any column again in Suri Diponegoro. Suri Diponegoro seemed to be seized that month as Ipo did not publish its summaries any longer. At the time, press delict was often activated. Well-known activists such as Chokoron Aminoto, Abdul Muiz, Seman, and Darsono were all punished by press delict. Did this matter damage Fahaldin's as a Muhammad afterwards? Year after 1920, Sufriken, a staff of the Office of Affairs, wrote to Yogyakarta resident. The fact that Muhammadiyah has an extremist figure, such as Fahaldin, does not necessarily mean that this association pursued political goals. In later documents, I found the letters of this office to the local governments, asking them not to disturb Fahaldin's activities. Clearly, there was a recognition difference among Dutch bureaucrats, especially between experts on native affairs and officials on the ground. Anyway, Fahaldin was not damaged by the punishment. He was going on his activities. After this period, Fahaldin went through trial and error and grew up to be an experienced organizer. Okay, next. What can be understood from these 4 reports in Suri Diponegoro? Fahaldin wrote what he really saw and heard on site. These reports showed that Fahaldin had a viewpoint of the common people, grassroots perspective. He displayed a strong sympathy for Kuromo or marginalized people. Later he wrote, I can't get the Kuromo people out of my mind. Kromo are all the time suffering from everything: livelihood, religion, ignorance, and etc. He was constantly trying to discover how to empower them. What I learned from these younger days was a bottom-up approach. He saw the problem from the viewpoint of the common people. Such a perspective helped him to promote Muhammadiyah later, when he became its vice president. He was rather distinctive from other nationalist leaders of the Pergerakan, enjoyed modern Dutch education. Well, I'm an old retired woman, but this is just a start to describing and reviving Fahadi in Indonesian history. I think we can know more about the early Muhammadiyah and reconsider Zaman Pergerakan. Next one. Masih ada satu. Oh? Yeah, thank you for listening to my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for your enlightening talk. It's about Haji Fakhruddin. Is this the father of Kiai A.R. Fakhruddin?
No.
Then I'm okay. Now we move to the final, to the response by Pak Martin to the three speakers.
Thank you. Well, I'm really.
You can stand up.
I have to stand up. I'm really honored, but it is too much honor, Faris. You exaggerate it. I mean, yes, I think the study of Indonesian Islam academically became very serious with the figure of Snoek Hugronje, who brings all the complexities that you mentioned into the field. Snoek Hugronje was a very serious scholar, and we can still read his books and learn a lot from them because he was an excellent observer. He was a good analyst, but he was also a colonial servant. And in one of his letters to a colleague in Germany, he writes, well, I'm here and there is so many fascinating things to study. I've been meeting the Arab community here and their language has particularities that are fascinating, but I don't have the time to do this because there are more important things. I want to serve my country. So he very consciously saw his contribution to scholarship as also service to his government, to his country, and obviously also as a form of religious engineering. That's perhaps a late term, but he definitely had. He had very clear ideas about how the government should respond to certain phenomena in society. And we all know, those of you who have lived through the New Order period, remember that the government at that time used policies that were basically the policies that had been advocated by Snoek Hugronje. Allow cultural expressions of Islam quite freely, strong support for Adat, a bit hesitant towards Islamic law, only, in his theory of Adat and Sharia, Sharia should only be accepted by law courts to the extent that Sharia was already accepted into Adat. So if the Adat is conform with the Sharia, okay, fine, you can have courts that judge according to the Sharia. But where it is not yet accepted, for instance, in inheritance regulations, it law courts should not follow the Sharia. Political expressions, political dissatisfaction should be suppressed, and it should be suppressed harshly. I mean, when he writes about jihad in Aceh, when Muslims are fighting a jihad, they only will give up when they are convinced that they cannot win, that they will be destroyed by continuing to fight. So you have to show them harshness. So he worked together with the harshest of military men, the butcher of Aceh, Van Heuts. So, I mean, he was a very complex figure, active in a very complex period. And he is the founder of, well, one of the major schools of Indonesian Islamic studies in Leiden. He is like a godfather there. And he is rightly criticized for his role in Edward Said's book, Orientalism. He's one of the great figures that where academic Orientalism is criticized because of its close relationship with power, with oppressive power. Not everything written by Edward Said in his book. In fact, most of the things he writes in his book do not concern academic Orientalism. They concern literature and politics, especially in British India. And you might say there is a long tradition of academic Orientalism that does not have this particular relationship to power and colonialism. In my own university in Utrecht, people have rediscovered a figure who was teaching there in the 17th century. He was a theologian, but he had studied Arabic and he had read the Quran. People often studied Arabic because it was a living language and that would help them to better understand Hebrew. And he wrote about Islam in a very positive way. He contrasted Islam positively with Western civilization. And we find a tradition, I think, in European culture of figures who take Islam as an alternative to Western civilization and try to emphasize positive aspects of Islam. So, I mean, Western academic tradition is quite complex. It is not just all obedient to power. But there is something in funding academic research that, well, often makes it serve direct political interests or even perhaps even fetish for modish academic intellectual interests. You mentioned 9/11, and of course there was suddenly a lot of money to understand where all the terrorists come from. So there is a lot of funding for particular studies. If you want to study Kitab Kuning, you may not get a scholarship, but if you study radical Islam and its history and how it is related with social political processes, yes, you might more easily get a scholarship. And I think many of us have or will be facing that. Indonesia's government, of course, also has specific interests. I think they are currently quite prominently visible. There is something called Islam Nusantara. I like the concept of Islam Nusantara, but I also see that Islam Nusantara has been adopted almost as if it is state ideology. Islam Nusantara is baik, harus didukung. And Islam that is not Nusantara enough, that is transnational and so on, is dangerous. I think, as far as said, that I think many of my colleagues do the same, especially the anthropologists, want to see the meaning of Islam in people's everyday life. And most Muslims are not only Muslims. They're Muslims, I mean, part of the day when they pray, or even when they... Not all Muslims pray regularly. Not all Muslims respect the Sharia. I know quite a few Muslims who eat pork, drink beer, and still they identify as Muslims. I mean, Muslim life is not just
the Sharia. Muslim life is not just what is taught here at UIN. Muslim life often involves politics. Politics, and there I will come back to that because I think Yasuko did something very important. She highlighted a part of Islam's history, a part of Islam's politics in Indonesia that has been forgotten, and I think deliberately erased from memory. It is right that you said in 1966, suddenly Haji Fakhruddin disappears. Like, what was his name? The editor of Medan Muslim, Haji Misbah from Solo. It was another Japanese who rediscovered him for us, Takashi Shiraishi. His book, I think in Indonesian it is called Zaman Bergerak, A World in Motion. His book about radical nationalists in the colonial time in the 1920s and 1930s is an eye-opener. These people were so courageous. They were so creative in formulating their criticism of the colonial state. It's amazing. Why are these people not celebrated? But they're still almost forgotten. And even after the fall of Suharto, there has not been really a rediscovery of warming. My talk is getting a little bit confused because suddenly I remember a discussion with Nurcholis Majid where he said, the Indonesian flag is red and white. And red and white have always been combined. If you have a Selamatan, that is bubur putih dan bubur merah. Blood and seminal fluid, I mean, traditionally in Javanese culture have always been together as yang and yin in Chinese culture. You cannot only have yang, you have to have yin. But it is in Indonesia as if the white has survived and the red has disappeared. The red was destroyed in 1965, 1966, and it has never been allowed to reappear. And by the red, I do not only mean the Communist Party, but I mean all these radical thinkers, people like Haji Fakhruddin. There was red. There was strong support for the people at the bottom of society, for the poor, for the Kromo, within Muhammadiyah. But somehow, most Muslim organizations, most Muslim associations have, in order to feel safe perhaps, have forgotten that part of their heritage. There has always been red and has always been white. The white, I mean, everyone knows, everyone celebrates the white. In Sarekat Islam, Haji Agus Salim is more or less the white. But there were other people. Coming back to Farish. Of course, I was not the first person to emphasize the importance of Indonesia as a part of the Muslim world. My older colleague and friend Karel Steenbrink, I think, is an important figure in this, both for people in Indonesia, because his work is available in Indonesian, and also internationally. Karel was a remarkable scholar who lived as a santri in a pesantren in Gontor. Right? Gontor has produced many people. It has produced Karel Steenbrink also. He was a professor at the IAIN in Jakarta, and he has written extensively about these things. And he also knew Haji Fakhruddin. He has written about the early Muhammadiyah, and he knew also that within Muhammadiyah there were other voices than the ones that we seem to remember. It is normal for people to look back at history through the eyes of today. We always think that NU and Muhammadiyah were in the 1920s, as they are today. Thanks to Hilman and Yasuko, we have heard today that no, they were very different. There are things that seem to have disappeared. And it's interesting to look back, because what happened at that time, there seems to be a return. There were debates about the caliphate, the most important debates in the Sarekat Islam in the 1920s, after Ataturk had abolished the Ottoman caliphate, And after the Wahhabis had reconquered Mecca and Medina, there were important debates. How should the Muslim world be governed? Should there be another caliph, or should there be an international institution, a committee, a sort of international government for all Muslims? Those debates were very heated in the 1920s. And then by the end of the 1920s, it is as if suddenly people give up and people turn inwards, and Syarikat Islam begins to look towards the situation inside Indonesia, and it forgets its transnational connections. And since then, we have associations in Indonesia that have been very Indonesian, very national. And in recent times, you see the events of the early 20th century returning. Transnational relations become much more important. The issue of the caliphate is again hotly debated. Many people feel strongly for or against the concept of a caliphate. And I think, yes, it is correct to see Indonesia as not just part of the Muslim world, but perhaps, why is it not the center of the Muslim world? It is the largest, it has the largest population of Muslims. If we count all the Muslims of Indonesia, we add those of Malaysia. And if you go to India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, I mean, there's so many more than all the Arabs. Why is South and Southeast Asia not considered as the heart of the Muslim world, and the Arab world as the periphery? The Arab world, of course, has very important symbolic resources. The Masjid al-Haram is only in the Arab world. There is no Masjid al-Haram. There is no Qiblat in Indonesia. But in terms of thought, Muslims who develop Islamic thought, why isn't Indonesia much more important to the rest of the Muslim world? There was a period when Indonesia seemed to have a leading role. 1955, the Bandung Conference was a time when Indonesia was very proud in its having won a colonial war. It was one of the few countries that had become independent through fighting a war. India never had to fight a war to become independent. Indonesia had to fight a war and won. So there was a pride. And at Bandung, Indonesia, together with Egypt and India, took the lead to form an association of non-aligned countries, countries that were neither pro-West nor pro-Russia, Soviet. And there were attempts also to form a Muslim transnational association, in which again Indonesia would have a leading role. But political developments inside Indonesia stopped that. And I think the rebirth of the idea that Indonesia has something to contribute to the rest of the world, be it Islam Nusantara, be it Pancasila, I think it is returning, and I think that's a very positive point. Political Islam. I remember when we were thinking of establishing ISIM, I wrote in a paper that political Islam is so boring. There are so many more interesting things to study about Islam. But then 9/11 happened, and whether we wanted or not, we had also to write about political Islam. But like in Indonesian politics, you had also people speaking about Islam, then political demands of Islam, both in the new order. P3 represented political demands of Islam. And you had the likes of Gus Dur, he said, well, no, pendekatan budaya, cultural Islam. Gus Dur was, I think, the first who very explicitly contrasted cultural Islam and political Islam. And yes, by accident, I have always been more attracted to cultural Islam. But I have also made an attempt, when I write about Muslim radicals, I try to speak to them. They're people. I still, when I'm in Jogja, I try to go and see Majlis Mujahideen and so on. And I think it is absolutely essential when you write about people, when you write about a movement, you have to try and get inside the head of the people in that movement. You have to try to understand how they think, why they do what they do. And you have to relate their ideas to other aspects of their life. Islam is only a small aspect of everybody's life. There are so many other aspects. You have economic needs, you have family needs, you have a job, you have other interests. You have to understand people as complete people, not just as an abstract Muslim. I was very pleased to listen to Hilman. I think, Hilman, that's an excellent. So I hope you will write a very good paper, because yes, I've also been fascinated by this connection between Jombang and Kauman. Najib Burhani, of course, also in his Muhammadiyah Java, has brought back the awareness that Muhammadiyah in Java, there were always these two Muhammadiyahs. There's Muhammadiyah Kauman, there is Muhammadiyah Pekalongan. And somehow we tend to define Muhammadiyah as the Muhammadiyah Pemurnian, that is more obvious in Pekalongan. But the Kauman is so fascinating. How is it possible that a person like Wardhan Diponingrat existed, who leads very syncretistic rituals in the court and at the same time is the leader of Muhammadiyah? But that's society. People are never 100% consistent, thank God. I love inconsistency. I think someone from this university once told me, well, Martin, you have to realize Jombang is different from other pesantrens. Jombang is Masyumi in NU. In Jombang, and especially Tubu Ireng, in Tubu Ireng, the family of Gustur, not Gustur, but his uncles, they were always much more politically minded. And they never really, with their hearts, they never left Masyumi. They were in support of Masyumi. Wahab Hasbullah is also such a fascinating figure, because he was a friend with many of these. He was a trader. He was a business partner with many people. I think business brought people also together. Family relationships. But Wahab, he was also interesting as a thinker. As a son of a Persian family, you might be interested to know that Hassan was originally a very traditionalist Muslim. And it's after a discussion with Wahab Hasbullah that he starts systematically studying the Hadith. This is narrated by another Dutch scholar, Pijper. Pijper was the last of the official advisors of the Netherlands Indies government. And he has a wonderful article, unfortunately only in Dutch, on reformism in Indonesia. And he knew personally, he knew Hassan personally, he knew Wahab, and he knew the founder of Al-Irshad, Surkati. He knew Surkati. He writes very sympathetic profiles of these people. And he shows, he also writes about them as human beings who do not strictly follow the Sharia, but go like Surkati, when he divorced his wife, he went far beyond what was prescribed by the Sharia, and throughout his life he continued sending money to her house. Pijper writes that Hassan had a discussion about the Bismillah in prayer, in Salat. And Wahab challenged him and said, try and find a hadith, a solid hadith, where this is mentioned that Bismillah should be read before every ayat. And he starts reading, he does not find a solid source. And this is the beginning of his starting to reject many traditional practices. So Wahab Hasbullah inspired Persis. Professor Mukti Ali, who had also studied at Tramas, told me that all this issue about ijtihad and tajdeed, for a few years there was a heavy debate, but then in the 1930s it was already finished. And Mahfouz Siddiq, the elder brother of Ahmad Siddiq, wrote a little book on ijtihad and taqlid, in which he finds an accommodation, in which Muhammadiyah and NU do no longer represent opposite poles in thinking of fiqh. So another question. Yesterday I was having dinner with a few friends from the other organization, NU, and they said, well, do you understand why among all the founders of Nahdlatul Ulama there is no one from Jogja? Padahal, Kiai Wahab knew many people in Jogja. Is it that he did not want to invite anyone because there was already NU? He didn't want to compete with NU? I mean, it's an interesting question. Why? There is no one from Solo among the founders either, but there were relations with several Kiais in Solo. But Jogja seems to be a blank spot. It's interesting. Why is there a form of mutual respect in which Kiai Wahab says, well, okay, this is your land, and I stay away from your ground. But I really like your choice of subject. I think it's important. You might also think about the evolution of individual pesantrens. Masku Mambang is very fascinating. Masku Mambang was originally also, when it was founded, was a traditional pesantren. And suddenly one of the Kiais decides that he starts following the modernists. And Masku Mambang becomes more radical even than Muhammadiyah in its rejection of many traditional practices. Masku Mambang is another fascinating. I have never seen a series. There may be this scripty somewhere, but I've never seen a serious study in English about Masku Mambang, although it is such a very special case. Yasuko, I like Yasuko's work. I often write, I read one or two sources and then I write a piece, and without knowing everything. Yasuko, when she goes to a subject like Haji Fakhruddin, she goes and she reads everything that has been written about him. She reads everything that he has written, and she reads everything where perhaps there might be a reference to him or where perhaps he might have contributed. She does a very, very systematic reading. It was a short presentation, but it is hard to imagine how much work must have gone into this little presentation, because she's been reading many pages. And again, I said already, it's very important that you bring to light again things that existed in Indonesia, but that seems to have been forgotten or repressed, suppressed. There was so much more intellectual endeavor in the 1920s and 30s. And I think we can still find inspiration in all these courageous thinkers, because at that time it demanded courage to think. Because the colonial power was strong, it was repressive, and when you were considered a lastpak, orang yang tidak bisa diatur, the repression could be quite severe. Many of these courageous thinkers were sent into exile to Bovendigul in Papua. So they were courageous. Nowadays, perhaps it does not need as much courage, because you will not go to jail if you say something that the government doesn't like. But still, the courage to think independently, to think outside of the frame of reference that you've been educated with, is still very difficult. It needs the courage to think outside the box, to think thoughts that your teachers have not thought. thinking is very important. Yesterday, we old people, we were all complaining that these young people nowadays, they do not, well, what do? They play with the telephone and so on. Teachers at university are so busy with administrative work that they have no time to think. And I think, yes, it is true. And it's becoming more and more true all over the world that people at universities have very little time left to think. But you have to fight to find that time to think. And you have really to devote time to thinking. Thinking is why you exist. Prove your existence by thinking and then writing your thoughts. Thank you. I feel extremely honored by your contributions. And thank you. I love you.
Thank you, Pak Martin. Now we move to the question and answer sessions. I think we can start with 3 or 4 questions from right side and left side. Yeah, Professor Mahasin. Any other? Professor Mahasin, and then Professor Mahasin.
Thank you very much. I think all of the speakers, because it forced me to think, as Martin said, that, well, from Faris, I think that Islam is intermingled. And in Islam, there is an intermingling between what is political and what is religious. So when you said that when you mention about the neutrality of studying Islam, I think it is impossible, because when you talk, for example, about the first leaders of Islam, so you will come across with all political people. Even though after that we know that these peoples are called the leaders of Islam, religious leaders of Islam. Yeah, Abu Bakr, Omar, and so on. So they are at the same time political and religious leaders. Even if we talk about Shafi'i is a religion, is very much mentioned as religious leaders, but he is actually also a political leader. So can we now base our study on neutrality in the pure sense, without any political mention or religious ideas and so on? So what we should do is to remember that while we studying fiqh, for example, we have to remember the power things in this matters. And also when we talk about political Islam or Islam politics, we have to remember that there's also something religious there. Yeah. And Pak Hilman, when Martin mentioned Wahab Asulullah as the prior Persis, so I remember his father, Hilman father. So now Hilman is a Persis within Muhammadiyah. Yeah, his father is a close friend of mine. But something I want to mention about your presentation is that there is a familial relationship between Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama in Jogja. For example, Munawir, the founder of Krapia, is a brother of Mudakir, the father of Abdul Qahar Mudakir, also a leader of Muhammadiyah. Abdul Rashad, the father of them, these two leaders, married to two or more women. I don't know, but and from the lady from Bantul, from a village, he got Munawir, and from someone from Kauman, he got Mudakir. So Mudakir and Munawir are brothers. Yeah. And also when you mentioned about Kauman and Jombang, you know that Kiai Nasrullah, has familial relationship with Kauman, Kiai Nasrullah of Nawak Beras. So I don't know if what you mentioned is what the name, siapa namanya? A lady, a famous lady from Jombang, a daughter of Nasrullah, no, Umdatul Khairat, yeah. So Umdatul Khairat has many relationship with Kauman. So Umdah is famous female preacher from Jombang now. So the family relationship in Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama is very much tight, I think. So until now, so you know that Hilmi Muhammad, not Hilmi Muhammadiyah. There are two Hilmi. Hilmi Muhammadiyah is the leader of Ibnu, but Hilmi Muhammad is the DPD atau Dewan Perwakilan Daerah. So it's one of Senate from Jogja, Hilmi, mentioned many times the relationship with Kahar Muzakir. Yeah. And many said that Kahar Muzakir is actually a Nahdi in Muhammadiyah, so it's like that. Yeah, and that's what I want to contribute here. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, I think we can. Okay. We have to collect questions or directly answer. Okay, please.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is. My question is to Ibu Yasuko. Do you find any trace of relation between Fakhruddin's theology and his political activities? I mean, he is a santri, he was a santri, trained as a theologian. Do you find any trace that he formulate his political aspirations in theological languages, or pokoknya any connection between his theology, how he understands his religion and his political activities, his radicalness, keradikalannya. Thank you. And for Prof. Hilman, saya pernah nemu, I find a curriculum of pendidikan ulama tarjih from 40s, and di situ it is clearly a Syafi'i Ash'ari manual. You can find Anuqaya and etc. But you can also find Risalatul Tauhid. But when I studied in pendidikan ulama tarjih in 2017, I study Fathul Majid Syarhu Kitabut Tauhid. So from Risalatul Tauhid to of Abduh to Kitabut Tauhid of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab. Prof. Najib Burhani said that the puritanical wave in Muhammadiyah came from Muhammadiyah Sumatra. But do you find, or do you think there's any wave of Puritanism selain Sumatra? Because the Sumatran like Hamka was clearly he has sympathy with Ash'ariyah and Shafi'iyah. But when I studied in PUTM, it is clearly Wahhabiyah. So is there any wave of Puritanism except from like Sumatra? Thank you.
Okay, please, Professor Aris.
In response to Professor Mahasin, I think when we talk about objectivity and neutrality, I'm certainly not suggesting that there has to be a neutral stand dividing religion or politics. I mean, the whole point as scholars who study Islam and Muslim society is that we know precisely that these worlds intertwine in Islam. And I think that is the standard of objectivity that we need to emphasize. And again, you know, in honor of Martin, what I have always respected about Martin's work is that in his study and his writings on Muslim society, Martin has never divorced the two. Yeah. So there's no division between, okay, this is the political domain, this is the societal domain. You cannot understand politics without understanding society. The social aspect of Islam and Muslim society is intertwined with its politics. And so that's why I think Martin's contribution is important, because the tendency to want to compartmentalize Muslim life and Muslim society is still there in some traditions, particularly Western traditions of scholarly analysis. And this is also why there is always this misunderstanding about Islam and Muslim behavior, especially in the kind of neo-Orientalist discourse that we get today. Let me give you an example. This is more true in media depictions of Islam as opposed to academic depictions of Islam. I agree with Martin, of course. You know, I mean, even Western academia is very complex. But in the way in which Muslim society has been presented post 9/11 in the international media in particular, you notice that there is one very specific character to the way Muslims are depicted, portrayed in the press compared to other communities, in the sense that, you know, Islam becomes this over-determining force. Now, if I prefer Kentucky Fried Chicken to McDonald's, it's not because I'm a Muslim. It's because I prefer Kentucky Fried Chicken to McDonald's. Yeah, and you notice that this sort of question doesn't arise with any other communities. If a Christian wants to eat McDonald's and not Pizza Hut, nobody says, is it because of his religion? But when it comes to Muslims, the answer somehow always has to be found in religion. And this, I think, is the dangerous thing. The tendency, particularly in some schools of Western scholarship, and especially in the Western media, to find the answer in Islam. Because, as Martin said, and we know this, we are complex. Muslims are complex. Our decisions are made, yes, on the basis of our beliefs, but also more than that, on our personal experiences, tastes, and preferences. So why is that complexity lost? Ya, tiba-tiba orang Muslim ini seperti robot. Ya, we have been programmed, and then we do things because we've been programmed that way. That is why, if you note, after 9/11, some of you may recall, in Western academic circles, especially in think tanks, suddenly there was an interest in Ibn Taymiyah. Ya, tiba-tiba semua orang mau baca Ibn Taymiyah. Kenapa? Karena Ibn Taymiyah itu dianggap bapa radikalisme Islam. Ya, jadi seperti kalau kita baca Ibn Taymiyah, langsung bikin bom. Ya, and that is the sort of simplistic, unacademic, in fact, anti-academic analysis, which I think we as scholars, Muslim or non-Muslim, we have to fight against. And this is why, again, I'm very much indebted to Martin, because in his works, and I've worked with Martin both in Asia and in Europe, and I admire the way Martin constantly reminds his readers and his fellow scholars that when we talk about Muslims, we are talking about human beings who are complex. And this complexity, I think, I agree with Martin, is something we should celebrate. Yeah. So.
Yeah, thank you. 2 days ago, I interviewed the grandsons of Raden Haji Hajid that I put here, the graduate of the Termas, Raden Haji Hajid. And his grandson told me that the situation in Kauman is not as smooth as we thought. The dynamic relationship between the leaders, the families in Kauman, when they send some students to Termas, it doesn't mean that when Dahlan emerged in Kauman, then they could accept Dahlan, and some even reject. And those who reject Dahlan are not simply that they are ignorant; they are knowledgeable about Islam. They graduated from pesantren, from Jombang, from Termas, and so forth and so on. But what is interesting is the process of transformations, social transformation in Yogyakarta, especially among the families of the modernists in Kauman, as well as in Kota Gede, who then finally accept the ideas of Islamic modernism. But what's interesting is the statement from Professor Nakamura, who says that the fact that most of the modern education established by Muhammadiyah in the early inception of this movement were established not by those who graduated from secular schools or Dutch school, but from those graduated from pesantren. So the question is why and what does modernism mean at the time? What does reformist mean? It's not simply about fiqh as we thought, but another dimension of ijtihad, the needs of the social needs, at the situation, the ijtihad among graduate of pesantren about the needs, how to offer better education for society at the time, and so on and so on. And this is, I think, very interesting situation. But the family and connection, one idea encouraged me to study further about this relationship between Kauman and Jombang. That in 1954 until 57, Abdurrahman Wahid was sent by his family from Jombang to stay in Yogyakarta, in Kauman, in the Kauman families with some Muhammadiyah leaders to pursue his SMP, because I heard that he was nakal, didn't want to pursue his study in SMP. So Kiai Wahid Hashim sent Abdurrahman Wahid to stay in Kauman for 3 years, from 1954 and 1957, to pursue his study here. So then he finally could pursue formal studies, Kiai Abdurrahman Wahid, in Yogyakarta. And what's interesting is that he stayed in the Kauman family. Okay, and of course, as I mentioned before, the connection between Kauman and Klapiak was very tight, despite the fact that one of Dahlan's wives is also the daughters of the Kiai of Klapiak. And slightly said by Professor Mahasin that Professor Muzakir, Kahar Muzakir is his father, right? And Muzakir has the brother of a connection with Pak Munawir of Klapiak. And this is what I would like to highlight, the kinship and family relationship and intellectual genealogy, as well as friendships, how these two types shape the patterns of Islam in Indonesia in general, and in particular among traditionalists and the modernists. And even before these terms emerged in Indonesia or popular in Indonesia, this relationship is quite strong. Pak Martin and friends, my observation was inspired by my latest article published in Baidra on the net friendship, and I saw the friendship of Masyumi people in the Netherlands, as well as Masyumi networks from Minangkabau networks, okay, as well Dutch graduate networks, and it's very instrumental in shaping the patterns of Muslim politics in Indonesia, especially among the Masyumi members, and their imaginations of Islamic education. So my arguments in this article is that Islamic educational institution, as well as Islamic higher educational institution, was founded, created, supported by those graduates from that school instead of from Islamic school. That's my thesis. Okay, so UIN, PTIN, especially supported and created establishment. Likewise, in Muhammadiyah, the Western types of schools were founded by those graduated from pesantren instead of those who from Western school. Thanks, Pak.
Okay, thank you. Before Professor Yasuko, I think, is there any reaction from Professor Mahasin? No? Okay, then we go to Professor Yasuko, please.
Yes, thank you for your question. I was asked the relationship between Fahruddin's theology and his politics, and it is a bit difficult to answer, but Fahruddin expressed radical opinion, but he never acted radical. And as far as I see, Fahruddin or Muhammadiyah acted in the existing system or in the existing order, and to they took the step by step change, and small efforts must be accumulated. Through that small or patient efforts, they can change the society. And yeah, I think so. Only once he acted radical, when the geographical resident in 1925, he was cited with Zending activities. At that time, Fahruddin and Muhammadiyah demonstrated show of force in Alun-Alun. But the incident is also forgotten. Yeah, but anyway, Fahruddin think of Kurma people, but it's weakness. So in 1922, in Jogja happened a pawn shop workers strike, but Fahruddin supported the strike, but he never wanted Muhammadiyah was involved in that strike, and persuaded the other Imogiri branch to go back home. So his thinking is radical, but his activity is very steady one. It's a very steady one. Okay, thank you.
Satu lagi tadi lupa.
Oh yeah, please.
I forget one question about the PUTM, Pendidikan Ulama Tarjih Muhammadiyah. It still exists, but what is interesting, the Pendidikan Ulama Tarjih Muhammadiyah right now still in the earliest form. They do not issue any certificate, and the ijazah is not recognized by the government. They're kind of Salafi of pesantren. I tried to meet the founders or some of the advocates of this, and also encourage him to lift up the status of this Salafi types of madrasa or pesantren, which is very good in terms of educating, the cadres of Muhammadiyah ulama. And Ayub is one of the students. I met him many years ago. I encouraged him to study in SOAS in London, and I sent him to SOAS in London, and I think graduate already. So, Pak Martin and friends, right now a lot of branch of Nahdlatul Ulama in some regions, or even the central board of Nahdlatul Ulama, try to establish university, schools, SMK, the high-tech high school, vocational school, and so on and so on. And at the same time, from the Muhammadiyah side, a lot of brands of Muhammadiyah try to establish pesantren. So what's going on here? Yeah, we will see, because exchange of experience also happens right now. If you look at the statistic in the Muhammadiyah, Pak Din, I think knows very well. The numbers of pesantren in Muhammadiyah increase rapidly. Okay, and some of the Muhammadiyah schools at the level of intermediate and high school still exist, but some are declining. But those pesantrens were well received, response by the public, and at the same time from the Nahdlatul Ulama side, so they established a lot of secular schools as part of the educational project. So that is the situation. And what's my point is, we have to see the evolutionary process of this changing, including the books or the literature studied at Madrasah Muallimin Muhammadiyah, as well as from Pendidikan Ulama tadi, how this literature change from the Shafi'i traditions, okay, into or into other literatures or local literatures. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next two question, I think. Oh, tamat. Oh, cukup. Okay. It's enough. Thank you very much for your attention, and sorry if I made many mistakes. Now, let us give applause to the speaker. Thank you very much, Professor Martin. Very much.
Bapak Ibu hadirin, mohon maaf untuk link presentasi, mohon Bapak Ibu dapat mengisi di barcode berikut ini. Terima kasih. Sekali lagi kami umumkan untuk presensi dan sertifikat mohon dapat mengisi presensi berikut ini.
For the participants of workshop, we will have a lunch. Participants or the authors. Masuk. Makan siang. Okay. Ya. Ada undangan ya? Cuman kan waktu itu organizer tanggal berapa?